May 29th, 1943. RAF Alconbury, England. 12 heavily modified B-17 flying fortresses sat on the tarmac, engines warming in the pre-dawn darkness. From a distance, they looked like any other bomber in the 8th Air Force inventory. Up close, the differences were impossible to miss. Extra turrets bristled from positions where bomb bays should have been. Twin 50-caliber machine guns protruded from waist windows instead of the usual singles, and bolted beneath the nose, where bombardiers normally crouched over Norden bomb sites, sat something no operational B-17 had ever carried into combat. A remotely operated turret mounting two 50-caliber Browning machine guns controlled from inside the plexiglass nose. 14 guns total. 17,000 rounds of ammunition where bombs should have been stored. These weren't bombers. They were gunships, flying escorts designed to protect the real bombers from the German fighters that were bleeding the 8th Air Force white over occupied Europe. The program had a name, YB-40. The Y stood for service test. The 40 stood for heavily armed B-17 variant number 40, in a desperate search for solutions to a problem that was killing men faster than training schools could replace them. And on this morning, these 12 aircraft were about to fly their first combat mission against the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire. Nobody at Alconbury that morning understood that they were watching the birth and death of the YB-40 program simultaneously. The concept would fail spectacularly within 10 weeks, but hidden inside that failure, mounted under the nose in a turret that weighed 475 pounds, was a solution that would save thousands of American lives and fundamentally alter the balance of air combat over Europe. The men climbing into these aircraft just didn't know it yet. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of death over Germany in early 1943 were brutally simple. Luftwaffe pilots had discovered the B-17's fatal vulnerability, and they were exploiting it with methodical precision. Head-on attacks, the flying fortress bristled with defensive armament, Sperry ball turret underneath mounting twin 50s, Bendix upper turret behind the cockpit with another pair, twin guns in the tail, single 50s at each waist position, cheek guns firing through plexiglass panels in the nose. On paper, the B-17 looked like its nickname, a flying fortress. 13 guns in the G model that would arrive later, overlapping fields of fire that should have created a defensive perimeter no fighter could penetrate. But paper specifications didn't account for physics and geometry, and German fighter pilots, particularly the veterans of the Jagdwaffe, understood both intimately. They'd learned the lesson through trial and blood in late 1942 and early 1943. Attack from 6 o'clock, behind the bomber, and you flew into a wall of coordinated fire. The tail gunner had clear lines of sight, the ball turret could rotate to track, the waist gunners could bring their weapons to bear. Formation defensive fire from neighbouring bombers created interlocking coverage that made rear approaches suicidal. Attack from 3 or 9 o'clock, from the sides, and you faced similar problems. Waist gunners had excellent visibility and clear firing solutions. The ball turret could track lateral movement, upper turret gunners could engage. The combat box formation that American tacticians had developed by mid-1943 specifically maximized this lateral defensive fire. Stagger bombers vertically and horizontally so every aircraft could support its neighbors. Create overlapping fields that force attacking fighters to transit multiple kill zones. German pilots who tried beam attacks against properly formed combat boxes paid for their aggression with their lives or their aircraft. But attacked from 12 o'clock, directly head-on, and the mathematics changed completely. The bombardier had 2 cheek guns, single 50s mounted in flexible ball mounts on either side of the forward fuselage. He could engage, but only with limited traverse, and while simultaneously trying to identify the target, set up the Norden bomb site, calculate wind drift and altitude, and prepare for the bomb run. The navigator might have a single handheld 50 firing through the plexiglass nose. Might, Some B-17Es and early Fs had a .30 caliber instead. Some had nothing. Closure rates made aiming almost impossible. A Focke-Wulf 190 approaching head-on at 300 miles per hour met a B-17 flying toward it at 180 miles per hour. Combined closure rate, 480 miles per hour. That translated to 704 feet per second. At 2,000 yards effective range for the .50 caliber, the window for aimed fire lasted 4.3 seconds. The German pilot, sitting behind armor plate in a fighter designed for this exact attack profile, needed to hit a target that filled his entire windscreen. The American bombardier needed to track a fighter traveling at 480 miles per hour of apparent velocity, while the entire aircraft vibrated from engine harmonics and his own hands shook from adrenaline. The Luftwaffe had discovered that frontal attacks worked. It really worked. Not as theoretical tactics in staff college exercises, but as practical methods for killing B-17 seconds efficiently. August 17, 1943. The twin raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg crystallized everything the 8th Air Force feared about deep penetration missions without adequate escort. 376 B-17 flying fortresses launched from bases across England. The most ambitious operation the 8th had attempted. Strike 2 critical targets simultaneously. Split German fighter reaction. Prove that daylight precision bombing could cripple Nazi war production without prohibitive losses. The plan assumed perfect timing. The Regensburg force, 146 bombers under Colonel Curtis LeMay, would take off first and hit the Messerschmitt aircraft factory. 10 minutes later, 230 bombers would strike the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. German fighters responding to the first raid wouldn't have time to land, refuel, rearm, and intercept the second force. In theory, English weather destroyed the timing before the first engine started. Fog blanketed the Midlands where the Schweinfurt force sat waiting. By the time visibility cleared enough for instrument takeoff, the Regensburg bombers were already over the Netherlands. German radar had tracked them. Luftwaffe controllers had scrambled every available fighter. And those fighters now had a 3-hour window to land, rearm with fresh ammunition, and prepare for the second wave. The slaughter began over Belgium. Jagdgeschwader 26, the Schlageter wing, hit the formations first, then JG-1, then JG-11. Wave after wave of Focke-Wulf 190 seconds and Messerschmitt 109 seconds, many of them attacking in line abreast formations from 12 o'clock level. 4 fighters spaced horizontally, firing simultaneously, then braking hard up and over the bomber formation before return fire could track them. The tactics exploited everything German intelligence had learned about B-17 vulnerability. Lieutenant Colonel Bernley Jr., flying in Piccadilly Lily with the 351st Bomb Squadron, described what he saw in after-action reports that became legendary. Frontal attacks hit the low squadron and lead squadron, while rear attackers went for the high. Some pilots were old-timers, throttling back to maintain the closure rate longer, allowing their 20mm cannons and 30mm cannons time to do maximum damage. Others were novices, bolting through the formations at full throttle, firing wildly, and relying on sheer firepower over precision. Both approaches killed bombers. The 305th Bomb Group lost 13 of its 16 B-17 seconds in minutes. 13 aircraft, 130 men, gone before they reached the initial point for the bomb run. Over Mannheim, as the Schweinfurt force turned northeast toward the target, the attacks intensified. German fighters that had engaged the Regensburg force 3 hours earlier were back, rearmed and refueled, joining fresh units that had been held in reserve. The math turned catastrophic. 60 B-17 seconds failed to return from the combined raids. 60 aircraft out of 376 launched. Over 15% loss rate. Another 11 bombers made it back to England so badly damaged they were scrapped for parts. Cannot be repaired. Total constructive losses. 162 more suffered battle damage requiring depot-level maintenance. Of the 2,900 men who flew that mission, 552 were killed or captured. Every 5th crew member. German fighter pilots claimed over 200 B-17 seconds shot down. The actual number was 60, but even correcting for overclaiming, the Luftwaffe had proven their tactics worked. Head-on attacks, executed by massed formations, overwhelmed forward defensive fire, and killed bombers with brutal efficiency. And the 8th Air Force had no answer. Spitfires could escort to Antwerp, P-47 Thunderbolts could barely reach the Belgian border. Beyond that, the bombers flew alone, and the attrition rate said what statistical analysts already knew but commanders didn't want to acknowledge. Losses were unsustainable. At this rate, by Christmas 1943, there wouldn't be an 8th Air Force capable of strategic operations. The institutional response to the frontal attack crisis revealed how organizations process terror. Field commanders knew what they saw: bombers burning, men dying, formations shattered by attacks that defensive armament couldn't counter. But knowing a problem exists and solving it are different challenges entirely. Adding forward-firing guns seemed obvious. Bombardiers and navigators field-modified their aircraft, sometimes with official blessing, often without. Extra 50 caliber machine guns appeared in nose compartments, mounted on improvised brackets welded by crew chiefs who understood that regulations mattered less than survival. The 8th Air Force Service Command issued nose gun installation kits, acknowledging what crews had already decided. But these modifications were slow, inconsistent, and limited by the fundamental constraint that bombardiers had other jobs. Running the Norden bomb site required both hands, complete concentration, and steady nerves during the bomb run when German fighters and flak were most intense. You couldn't aim a bomb site and fire a machine gun simultaneously. The solutions needed to be institutional, designed into production aircraft, not improvised in the field. And institutions move slowly, especially when the solution requires admitting that current aircraft are inadequate. Enter the escort fighter concept. Not fighter escorts like P-47 Seconds and Spitfires. Those were separate aircraft with their own limitations. This was something different. A B-17 modified to carry so many guns, so much ammunition, so much defensive firepower, that it could protect other bombers through sheer volume of fire, fly in formation with bomb-carrying aircraft, and swat German fighters out of the sky before they could execute killing attacks. The logic seemed sound. B-17 Seconds already had the range to reach any target in Germany. They could maintain formation with other bombers. They had the structural strength to mount additional weapons. Why not take advantage of that capability? The YB-40 program began in April 1942 with specification studies. By November, Lockheed's Vega division had modified the first prototype, converting Boeing-built B-17F, serial number 41 to 24341, into something that looked like a bomber but had a completely different mission. The bomb bay was empty. No bombs, no bomb racks, just ammunition storage. 11,135 rounds standard load. Could be increased to 17,265 if fuel load was reduced. The weight trade-offs were calculated down to individual pounds. Dorsal turret in the radio compartment, behind the existing upper turret, twin 50s. Martin-built unit because Sperry couldn't deliver enough of their units to meet demand. Waist positions converted from single gun mounts to twin mounts. 4 guns instead of 2. Tail guns kept their twin mount configuration but received power boost for faster traverse. The ball turret stayed. Sperry design, electrically driven hydraulic system, excellent fields of fire, but vulnerable to damage and notoriously difficult to escape in an emergency. And the nose. The distinctive modification that made the YB-40 immediately recognizable. Bendix chin turret. 475 pounds of electro-hydraulic machinery, mounting twin 50 caliber Brownings in a power-operated turret beneath the bombardier's station. The bombardier controlled it from a sight in the plexiglass nose, using hand grips that sent electrical signals to servo motors that rotated the turret in azimuth and elevation. It was revolutionary technology. Remote turret control wasn't new. Sperry had developed similar systems, but integrating it into a combat aircraft in a position that finally addressed the frontal attack problem, that was new. The XB-40 first flew November 10, 1942. Test pilots reported the added weight and drag reduced performance predictably. Top speed dropped from 300 miles per hour to 296. The service ceiling fell from 35,000 feet to 29,400. Climb rate was significantly worse. But firepower? The firepower was impressive. 1450 caliber machine guns, most of them in power-operated turrets with fields of fire that overlapped to create a defensive sphere. On paper, the YB-40 looked like exactly what the 8th Air Force needed. 20 more aircraft were ordered, modified by Douglas at their Tulsa, Oklahoma facility using Vega-built B-17F airframes. These became YB-42s, the Y prefix indicating service test status. 4 more became TB-40 trainers. Various armament configurations were tried. Some aircraft got 4-gun nose turrets instead of 2. Others mounted 40mm cannons. A few carried up to 30 guns of various calibers in multiple positions. The experimentation revealed what designers already suspected. More wasn't always better. 30 guns meant 30 ammunition feeds that could jam, 30 recoil mechanisms that could fail, 30 systems that added weight and complexity without proportional benefit. The standard configuration settled at 14 guns. Still far more than any operational B-17. Still impressive by any measure. By March 1943, the first YB-42s were ready for deployment. In April, 12 aircraft arrived in England, assigned to the 327th Bombardment Squadron of the 92nd Bomb Group at RAF Alconbury. The 327th was the only 8th Air Force squadron to ever operate YB-42s in combat. That distinction would become significant later, but in April 1943, the crews saw it as recognition of their experience and capability. The 92nd was one of the original heavy bomb groups in England. They'd flown combat missions since September 1942. Their crews knew the aircraft, knew the routes, knew what worked and what killed you. If anyone could make the YB-40 concept succeed, it would be the men of the 327th. Training began immediately. YB-40 crews learned the systems, practiced formation flying with the extra weight and altered handling characteristics, fired thousands of rounds at towed targets to develop proficiency with the new turrets. The chin turret particularly demanded attention. Bombardiers who'd spent months mastering the Norden sight now had to think like gunners, tracking fast-moving targets while operating completely different equipment. Some adapted quickly, others struggled. All of them understood the stakes. Their aircraft didn't carry bombs. Their job was to keep other aircraft alive long enough to reach the target and return home. May 29, 1943. First operational sortie. Target, Saint-Nazaire submarine pens. 8 YB-42s launched with the main bomber stream. Mission profile, standard. Climb to altitude, form up, cross the English Channel, penetrate enemy airspace, protect the bombers during their run, and return home. The German reaction was lighter than expected. A few fighter passes, some flak over the target, but nothing that tested the YB-40's capabilities properly. The aircraft performed as designed. Engines ran smoothly despite the added weight. Turrets functioned. The chin turret engaged several fighters with inconclusive results. Claims were filed. Confirmation was impossible in the chaos of combat. The mission was judged a success because all the YB-42s returned. That alone felt like victory in a campaign where loss rates regularly hit 15 to 20%. 9 more missions followed between May and early August. The targets read like a catalogue of German strategic infrastructure: Wilhelmshaven, Kiel, Hamburg, Le Mans, Villacoublay. Each mission added data points to an equation that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The YB-42s could defend themselves. Their concentrated firepower made them formidable targets. German pilots learned quickly that attacking a YB-40 head-on meant flying into more defensive fire than any single bomber should have been capable of generating. Combat reports noted instances where Luftwaffe fighters broke off attacks after identifying a distinctive chin turret and extra dorsal turret that marked the gunships. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the YB-42s couldn't defend the bombers they were supposed to protect, not effectively. The problem revealed itself on the second mission, June 22, 1943. Target: synthetic rubber plants at Hels in the Ruhr Valley. Deep penetration. Heavy opposition expected and received. The bomber stream took devastating losses. 16 B-17 seconds failed to return. The math said 160 men were killed or captured. One YB-40 went down, serial number 42 to 5743, shot down by fighters over Germany. 10 men lost. But it was the return flight that exposed the fatal flaw in the escort bomber concept. Standard B-17 seconds dropped their bomb loads over the target. 6,000 pounds of ordnance released. The instant those bombs left the racks, those aircraft became lighter, faster, more maneuverable. Pilots could increase airspeed. Formations could climb to higher altitude where German fighters struggled with thin air and reduced engine performance. The tactical flexibility that came with being lighter saved lives on the egress leg when German fighters made their final passes before breaking off due to fuel constraints. The YB-42s still carried 17,000 pounds of ammunition, armour, extra turrets, structural reinforcements, and all the weight that made them gunships. They couldn't drop anything. Their mission required them to stay heavy all the way home. Physics delivered its verdict without mercy. The empty bombers accelerated to cruising speeds the YB-42s couldn't match. Within 20 minutes of leaving the target area, the gunships were struggling to keep formation. Pilots pushed throttles forward. Engines strained at cruise climb power, burning fuel at rates that made navigators nervous. Still, the formation pulled away. By the time they crossed back into friendly airspace, the YB-42s were trailing by miles, no longer capable of protecting anyone. Colonel William N. Reed, commanding officer of the 92nd Bomb Group, filed reports after each mission. The language was careful, professional, avoiding conclusions while presenting facts that led to only one conclusion. YB-42s effective during inbound flight. Defensive fire superior to standard B-17. Chin turret particularly effective against frontal attacks. However, aircraft were unable to maintain formation with bombers after the target. Separation distance increases to unsafe levels during egress. Protective capability compromised. The crews saw it more directly. "We can protect them on the way in," one YB-40 pilot said in a squadron debrief. "Soon as they drop, we're anchors. They leave us behind, and we can't do a damn thing about it." Another pilot was more blunt. "Best defended bombers in the 8th Air Force, flying alone, 30 miles behind the formation. Great plan if the goal was to give German fighters easy targets." The tactical assessments came from multiple sources, and they all agreed. The 14 operational missions flown by YB-42s between May 29 and July 29, 1943, demonstrated a fundamental mismatch between concept and reality. The gunships could protect themselves reasonably well. 5 confirmed kills and 2 probable kills were claimed across all missions. 1 YB-40 lost. Those were acceptable exchange ratios by the standards of 1943, though nowhere near the overwhelming defensive superiority the program had promised. But protecting other bombers, the mission they'd been designed for? Complete failure. The weight penalty was insurmountable. No amount of engine power, pilot skill, or tactical adjustment could overcome the physics. A heavy aircraft simply couldn't keep pace with lighter aircraft over the 4 to 6 hours of a typical deep penetration mission. 1943. Mission 83. Target: German fighter airfields. The last operational sortie for the YB-40 program. 2 YB-42s launched as part of the bomber stream. Both returned safely. The mission report noted their presence almost as an afterthought. By August, the decision had been made at command level. The YB-40 program was officially terminated. The surviving aircraft would return to the United States for use as gunnery trainers, stripped of their combat modifications, relegated to teaching new gunners the basics of turret operation and aerial gunnery. 11 months from first prototype to program cancellation. Millions of dollars invested in development, modification, training, deployment. 24 aircraft were built, 14 missions were flown, 1 aircraft lost, and the 8th Air Force was back where it started, facing the same problem that had inspired the YB-40 program in the first place. B-17 seconds were still dying from frontal attacks. German fighters were still exploiting the nose as a vulnerable point. The losses were still unsustainable, except something had changed, something that almost nobody noticed in the aftermath of the YB-40's failure. Colonel Reed's final assessment report included a statistical analysis that buried a critical finding in bureaucratic language. Analysis of YB-40 defensive effectiveness indicates overall increase in firing power versus standard B-17F of approximately 20%. Actual effectiveness against enemy fighters estimated at 10% improvement. The majority of this improvement is attributable to the Bendix Chin turret installation. The majority of this improvement, that phrase sat in the middle of a paragraph discussing the program's failure. 300 pages of documentation about weight problems, formation keeping difficulties, maintenance challenges, and tactical limitations. And buried in the technical analysis, one sentence that said, "The Chin turret worked," not the extra dorsal turret that added weight and complexity, not the twin waist guns that blocked escape hatches, not the armor, the ammunition, the structural reinforcements. The Chin turret, that specific piece of technology, mounting 2 50 caliber machine guns in a remotely operated turret beneath the nose, had proven effective against frontal attacks. The thing everyone had said was impossible to integrate into a combat aircraft. The German pilots had noticed. After-action reports from Luftwaffe units that engaged YB-40 seconds noted the Chin turret specifically. American bomber, distinctive forward turret beneath nose, engages at extended range. Recommend avoiding head-on attacks against this type. Classification, escort aircraft or heavy fighter variant. The intelligence was incomplete. German analysts didn't understand that these were modified bombers, not a new aircraft type. But they understood the tactical implication immediately. This variant could shoot back during frontal attacks with power-operated forward turrets instead of handheld guns. That changed the engagement geometry significantly. American intelligence officers conducting routine interrogations of captured Luftwaffe pilots started hearing the same story in different words. "Some of your bombers have a turret under the nose. We know to look for it. Harder to attack those from the front. Is this standard now or special aircraft?" The pilots didn't know they were describing YB-40 seconds that would never fly again. They were describing a capability that had made them change tactics. And someone in 8th Air Force headquarters was paying attention. The Chin turret had been developed specifically for the YB-40 program by Bendix Aviation Corporation. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering. The turret itself weighed 475 pounds, but the complete installation, including mounting structure, electrical systems, hydraulic lines, ammunition feeds, and armor protection added over 800 pounds to the aircraft's nose. That weight sat forward of the center of gravity, creating handling challenges that required ballast adjustments and careful loading procedures. But it worked. The 250 caliber M2 Browning machine guns could traverse approximately 90 degrees left and right from centerline and elevate from 30 degrees below horizontal to approximately 50 degrees above. That gave the bombardier a forward-firing capability that covered most of the critical threat zone for frontal attacks. The guns were fed from ammunition boxes mounted in the nose compartment, initially 300 rounds per gun. Later, variants increased capacity to 400 rounds per gun. Rate of fire, 750 to 850 rounds per minute per gun, depending on ammunition type and gun condition. That meant roughly 90 rounds per gun during a sustained 10-second burst. The bombardier controlled the turret using a computing gun sight mounted at his station. The sight incorporated basic lead calculation, accounting for target speed, range, and bomber velocity. Not sophisticated by later standards, but functional, the gunner placed the reticle on the target, the computing mechanism calculated deflection, and the guns fired where the target would be, not where it appeared to be. The system wasn't perfect, Harmonics from the guns firing caused the entire nose to vibrate. The plexiglass panels, designed for visibility rather than structural rigidity, flexed under recoil loads. Early installations cracked nose panels when guns were fired at maximum elevation. Engineering fix: blast deflectors on the gun barrels to redirect muzzle blast away from the plexiglass. Problem solved with sheet metal and field modifications. But the fundamental capability was there. A bombardier could now engage attacking fighters during their approach, before they reached firing range, with power-operated guns that stayed on target despite aircraft motion and vibration. That was the revolution, not the guns themselves. 50 caliber machine guns weren't new, not the turret mechanism. Remote turret control had existed since the late 1930s. The revolution was putting that capability in the one position where it mattered most for B-17 survivability and making it work reliably under combat conditions. Someone made a decision. The historical record doesn't clearly document who, when, or exactly how the discussion unfolded. What's documented is the outcome. In July 1943, while the YB-40 program was being terminated, the 8th Air Force Service Command issued a directive. All late production B-17F aircraft arriving in theatre would be retrofitted with Bendix chin turrets before assignment to operational squadrons. The work would be done at modification centres in England, not in combat units. Install the turret, test-fire the guns, brief the bombardiers on operation, and send the aircraft to their assigned bomb groups. Not suggested. Not recommended. Mandatory. Simultaneously, Boeing received notification from Army Air Forces Materiel Command. The B-17G, already in development as an improved version of the F model, would incorporate the chin turret as standard production equipment, not as an option, not as a field modification, factory installed, from the first aircraft off the assembly line. Douglas Aircraft, building B-17 seconds at their Long Beach plant under the BVD production pool arrangement, received the same directive. The last 86 B-17Fs, built by Douglas, starting with Block 75DL, would include the chin turret installation. These aircraft began reaching England in August 1943. Just weeks after the last YB-40 mission, the bombardiers initially regarded the chin turret with suspicion. It came from a failed program. That alone was enough to make experienced crews cautious. Combat flyers developed strong opinions about what worked and what killed you. Equipment from a program that had been terminated after 14 missions? That was equipment you questioned. The training was minimal. Bombardiers were already overloaded. Navigate to target, operate Norden bomb site, calculate wind drift, altitude compensation, trail angle, communicate with the pilot during the bomb run, execute the drop sequence. Now, also operate a remotely controlled turret during the approach when German fighters were most aggressive. Some crews refused. Unit commanders couldn't order a bombardier to use the chin turret if he felt it would compromise his primary mission. Others were pragmatic. Technical Sergeant James Keefe, bombardier with the 305th Bomb Group, articulated what many thought. I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. German fighters are killing us on head-on passes. This gives us something to shoot back with. I'll learn to use it. The learning curve was steeper than anyone anticipated. The chin turret had significant blind spots, but it had nothing to do with the chin turret's design. It was a computing site. The reticle and lead calculation mechanism only worked if you could see the target clearly enough to judge range and speed. Fighters coming out of the sun were invisible until they were already firing. Fighters approaching through clouds or haze appeared too late for effective engagement. And the psychological challenge of operating the turret while preparing for the bomb run created stress that degraded performance for both tasks. After-action reports from September and October 1943, as chin turret-equipped B-17Fs entered service in larger numbers, showed mixed results. Some bombardiers became proficient quickly. They practiced during transit flights, developing the muscle memory and situational awareness needed to switch between bomb site operation and turret control. Others never adapted. They defaulted to their primary mission, treating the chin turret as backup defense to be used only in extremis. but the aircraft now had the capability. That was the critical change. German fighter pilots couldn't know which B-17 seconds had proficient chin turret operators and which didn't. They couldn't know if the bombardier they were about to attack head-on was a crack shot or had never fired the guns in combat. The uncertainty alone changed attack patterns. Pilots who had grown comfortable with frontal attacks because B-17 return fire was minimal and inaccurate now had to account for power-operated turrets that could track their approach and deliver concentrated fire. Some continued pressing attacks anyway. Aggressive pilots, experienced pilots, pilots who understood that daylight bombing had to be stopped regardless of personal risk. Those men still came in head-on, accepting the increased danger because the mission demanded it. But others hesitated, broke off earlier, attacked from less favourable angles where B-17 defensive fire was heavier, but chin turret fire was less effective. The cumulative effect was measurable but not dramatic. Loss rates from frontal attacks didn't drop to zero, they decreased incrementally. A few percentage points. Aircraft that might have been shot down limped home instead. Crews that should have died survived with wounds and damaged aircraft. Then the B-17G arrived. August 1943. First production aircraft rolled off Boeing's Seattle assembly line. The G model incorporated everything learned from 2 years of combat operations. Staggered waist gun positions so gunners didn't obstruct each other. Enclosed waist compartment with windows instead of open positions. Improved tail gun installation, the Cheyenne modification, with larger plexiglass panels for better visibility. And the chin turret, factory installed, fully integrated, tested and calibrated before the aircraft ever left Seattle. Boeing built 8,680 B-17Gs. Douglas and Vega added more under the BVD production pool. The G model became the definitive flying fortress, produced in greater numbers than all previous versions combined, and every single one had the Bendix chin turret as standard equipment. By December 1943, the transition was largely complete. Most combat groups had converted to G models or late F models with chin turrets. The standardization meant training improved. Bombardiers entering combat for the first time received chin turret instruction as part of their qualification, not as an afterthought. Maintenance procedures were documented. Parts were available. Technical specialists understood the systems. The improvisation and uncertainty that had characterized the initial deployment gave way to institutional knowledge. This is how you operate it. This is how you maintain it. This is how you fight with it. The German response came in the form of modified tactics that acknowledged reality without explicitly stating what had changed. Luftwaffe tactical directives from late 1943 and early 1944 increasingly emphasized attacks from high 6 o'clock, diving through formations from above and behind. Frontal attacks didn't disappear. They remained part of the tactical playbook because they still worked against poorly defended formations. But the emphasis shifted. Where frontal attacks had been the primary tactic in early 1943, accounting for over half of all B-17 losses to fighters, by early 1944, they represented less than 30%. The chin turret wasn't solely responsible for this shift. Long-range fighter escorts played a much larger role. P-51 Mustangs arriving in theatre with drop tanks that gave them the range to escort bombers to Berlin and back fundamentally changed the air war. Luftwaffe pilots now had to fight through American fighters before reaching the bombers, and that attrition degraded their ability to execute any attack, frontal or otherwise. But within the specific domain of head-on attacks, the chin turret had demonstrable impact. Bombardiers, who became proficient with the system, reported engagement opportunities that hadn't existed before. You saw them setting up for the pass. One bombardier from the 91st Bomb Group explained in a squadron intelligence debrief. 3. 4,000 yards out, you could get the turret on target and start firing before they committed to the attack run. Sometimes they'd break off. Sometimes they'd come in anyway and you'd keep shooting until they passed over or went through the formation. Either way, you were doing something instead of just watching them come at you. The statistical validation came from unexpected sources. The 8th Air Force kept meticulous records of combat losses, tracking not just how many aircraft were lost, but how they were lost. Fighter attacks from what direction, flak hits in which sections of the aircraft, collisions, mechanical failures, all of it documented in missing air crew reports and combat analysis summaries. In September 1943, before chin turrets were widespread, frontal attacks accounted for 42% of fighter-inflicted B-17 losses where attack direction could be determined. By March 1944, with most groups flying G models or retrofitted late F models, frontal attacks accounted for 28% of fighter losses. The absolute number of bombers lost continued to fluctuate based on mission parameters, German fighter availability, and escort effectiveness. But the relative contribution of frontal attacks to overall losses decreased measurably. Some of that decrease came from improved fighter escort, some came from better formation discipline and tactics, but operational research teams conducting analysis for the 8th Air Force Statistical Control Office identified the chin turret as a significant contributing factor. Their language was careful, avoiding claims of causation where only correlation existed, but the conclusion was clear. Aircraft equipped with functioning chin turrets and trained operators experienced lower loss rates from frontal attacks than aircraft without those capabilities. The human testimony cuts through statistical abstractions with the clarity that only survival provides. Second Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, flew his 25th and final mission on May 19, 1943, before the chin turret became standard equipment. In post-war interviews, he described frontal attacks as the most terrifying experience of his combat tour. You're flying straight and level on the bomb run. You can't take evasive action, or you'll throw off the bombardiers' calculations, and you see them coming, head on. You know they're going to shoot, and you know your nose guns aren't going to stop them. You just hope they miss or hit someone else. All you can do is fly the airplane and wait. First Lieutenant William R. Lawley Jr. flew his B-17G, the cabin in the sky, on a mission to Leipzig on February 20, 1944. German fighters attacked his formation head-on. Lawley's bombardier engaged with the chin turret, firing sustained bursts at the incoming for 190 seconds. One fighter broke off, trailing smoke. Another pressed the attack, cannon shells ripping through the B-17's cockpit. Lawley was wounded. His co-pilot was killed. The aircraft was nearly unflyable, but Lawley maintained control, kept the crippled bomber in formation, and somehow brought it home. He received the Medal of Honor for that mission. In his citation, no mention of the chin turret, but in interviews years later, he credited the bombardier's defensive fire with disrupting the initial attack enough that the fatal damage was reduced to survivable damage. "We got hit hard," Lawley said, "but it could have been worse. My bombardier was shooting back. That made a difference." The mythology around the B-17 as a self-defending bomber capable of fighting its way to any target began to crack under the weight of loss statistics in early 1943. The reality was more complex and less reassuring. Bombers needed escorts, fighters were essential. But within that reality, incremental improvements in defensive capability mattered. Each improvement that made German pilots more cautious, that forced them to break off attacks earlier, that degraded their accuracy, saved lives. The chin turret was one such improvement, not the largest, not the most significant. The P-51 Mustang matters more. Long-range drop tanks mattered more. Better tactics, better training, better coordination between bombers and escorts, all of those mattered more. But the chin turret mattered. It addressed a specific vulnerability that German pilots had ruthlessly exploited. It gave bombardiers a tool that worked. And it came from a program that everyone agreed had failed. The YB-40, flying gunship, escort bomber, concept that looked brilliant in staff meetings and collapsed under operational reality. 14 missions, 1 aircraft lost, program terminated, except the termination wasn't complete. One piece of the YB-40 survived, proliferated, became standard equipment on every B-17G that flew for the rest of the war. The Bendix chin turret, developed for a failed program, proved to be the only successful element of that program. And because it was integrated into an operational bomber rather than a specialized escort aircraft, It actually fulfilled the mission the YB-40 had been designed for: protect bombers from frontal attack. By May 1944, as the 8th Air Force prepared for its role in supporting Operation Overlord, the transformation was complete. Nearly every operational B-17 inches England had a chin turret. Bombardiers trained on the system as part of standard qualification. Maintenance crews understood the installation. Parts supply had caught up with demand. What had been experimental technology 12 months earlier was now baseline equipment. Nobody called it the YB-40 turret. That association with failure had been quietly erased from institutional memory. It was just the chin turret. Standard equipment, works as designed, use it. The Germans stopped commenting on it in intelligence reports. It was no longer novel enough to warrant special mention, just another defensive system on Allied bombers, like the ball turret or tail guns. Expected, accounted for in tactics, still dangerous, but no longer surprising. The war moved toward its conclusion with violence and momentum that rendered individual technical innovations almost invisible against the larger narrative. The combined bomber offensive destroyed German industrial capacity. Strategic bombing, whatever its moral complications, achieved its military objectives. German fighters were swept from the sky. Oil refineries burned. Transportation networks collapsed. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was a spent force, grounded by lack of fuel more than lack of aircraft. The B-17G flew its final combat mission in Europe on April 25, 1945, 2 days before the last heavy bombing mission in the theatre. By then, over 8,000 B-17Gs had been built. Every one is equipped with a chin turret. The total impact of that single component across the entire air campaign is impossible to quantify with precision. Too many variables, too many confounding factors. But the crews knew. The men who flew those missions, who faced fighters attacking head-on, who operated the chin turrets or flew in formations with aircraft that had them, understood the value. Interviews conducted decades after the war, when veterans had time to process their experiences and separate what mattered from what seemed important at the time, consistently identified the chin turret as significant, not war-winning, not decisive, but significant, an improvement that made a dangerous mission marginally less lethal. In a conflict where margins measured in percentage points translated to hundreds of lives that mattered, Clinton Hanna, the Westinghouse engineer who had developed the tank gun stabilizer that gave Sherman crews a critical advantage, never worked on the B-17 chin turret. That was Bendix Aviation's project, but the parallel was striking. Both systems emerged from understanding a specific tactical problem. Both faced skepticism from crews who'd learned not to trust complicated equipment that promised solutions to hard problems. Both required training and institutional support to realize their potential, and both ultimately proved their value not through dramatic battlefield miracles, but through incremental, persistent improvement in survival rates. The YB-40 program, evaluated purely as a military procurement effort, was a complete failure. 24 aircraft were built, 14 missions were flown. The program terminated after 3 months of combat testing. Millions of dollars invested with no operational return. By any standard measure of success, a disaster. But hidden in that failure was a success that the program's architects never intended and possibly never recognized. The chin turret, developed as one component of a comprehensive escort bomber solution, turned out to be the only component worth saving. And because someone paid attention to the data, because someone read Colonel Reed's assessment carefully enough to see the buried finding about the chin turret's effectiveness, because institutional processes allowed good ideas to survive bad programs, that component was saved, integrated into production aircraft. Standardized across the fleet, turned from experimental technology into baseline capability. That's how institutional learning works when it works correctly. Failures are examined. Components are evaluated independently. What works is preserved even when the larger program fails. The people who made those decisions, whoever they were, saved lives. Not dramatically. Not obviously. The men who survived, because a German fighter broke off a head-on attack, discouraged by chin turret fire, never knew they'd been saved. They just knew they made it home. But statistically, across thousands of missions and tens of thousands of sorties, the effect was real. Frank Szymanski never became famous for his rivet pattern that revolutionized B-17 wing assembly. Clinton Hanna received quiet recognition for his tank stabilizer, but no public celebration. And the engineers at Bendix who developed the chin turret remained anonymous, their work buried in technical reports and procurement documents. That's how war actually works. Not through individual heroes and dramatic breakthroughs, though those exist and matter, but through institutional processes that identify problems, fund solutions, test them under real conditions, and implement what works while discarding what doesn't. The chin turret's journey from YB-40 component to standard B-17G equipment exemplifies that process. A good idea embedded in a failed program, recognized by someone paying attention, extracted, refined, deployed. 8,680 B-17Gs built, every one with a chin turret derived from a program everyone agreed was a failure. The irony is almost too perfect. The Escort bomber that couldn't keep up with the bombers it was supposed to protect contributed the one piece of technology that let those bombers protect themselves. The YB-40 failed at its mission, but succeeded in ways its designers never imagined. And thousands of men who flew B-17Gs in 1944 and 1945 came home because someone decided that a component from a failed program deserved a second chance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.